And I see that the meeting recording is starting. So if anybody has any issues with that, please let us know now. Otherwise, know that you're being recorded. So first off, let me just start by welcoming everybody and saying thank you very much. We know your time is valuable, and we greatly appreciate your joining us today. My name is Eric Hunter. I'm an associate professor from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And my role in this project is to take all of the different findings that we've done from the social scientists, the natural scientists, the webinars that we've had, and at the end of the project in February, when we invite you to our next seminar, our goal is to develop a series of policy briefs. And this stakeholder webinar today is a very important part of this process. So again, thank you for coming. Before I go into talking about the agenda for today, I wanted to hand the floor over to Valerio Abadesi from DG Agri. He is the research program officer, and he has agreed to say a few words about the project.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Many thanks, Eric, and also many thanks to Paul and all the Super G Consortium for the invitation, and also for organizing the workshop to discuss policies that are needed, let's say, to support sustainable permanent grassland management in Europe. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of my colleague Susanna Gaona, who is the policy officer of this project, for not being able to stay with us, to join us today due to other commitments. As you heard, my name is Valerio Badessa from the unit dealing with research and innovation, and I have the pleasure to replace Susanna, and thank you all for joining the discussion. Just to recap a bit for those who are not aware, Super G is an Horizon 2020 project funded by the European Commission, and it is addressing, let's say, key questions related to the existence or to the management of permanent grassland, which, as you know, are key to deliver multiple ecosystem services, policies that are effective in optimizing the productivity of permanent grassland and supporting at the same time biodiversity and delivering a number of other ecosystem services are needed. And in this regard, I would like to mention that at the end of November, the Commission published a report to the European Parliament, to the Council, that presents a summary of the CAP strategic plan for 23-27. And from the report, it emerged that environmental and climate commitments under all the 28 CAP strategic plan amount to about 33 billion, while eco schemes make up to almost 45 billion euro. And 90% of the European agricultural area is subject to agroecological practices. In particular, the plans show certain efforts, significant efforts on practices for carbon sequestration and storage in soil and biomass through a mix of conditionality and also voluntary intervention in relation to soil improvement, conservation and management of permanent grassland, wetlands and peatlands, and support for agroforestry and also landscape in general features. Let's say there are, we can say, good news, and we hope that the implementation of this measure will contribute to the overall efforts, including those of Super G project, to better understand the importance and the functioning of permanent grasslands and also their performance across all Europe. The key to the success is not only the cooperation among farmers, but also working with landowners, managers, advisors, NGO, researchers, policymakers, business community, etc. So we are glad to see such a high interest in the Super G project for so many actors, including some commission services also present today. And this highlights the relevance and the potential of permanent grassland for achieving simultaneous several objectives of the European Green Deal. The outcomes of today's discussion will be relevant not only from the perspective of building agricultural environmental policy that work for permanent grassland, but on the side of your Horizon Europe, the framework program that you know, we are now starting the preparation of the last two work programs under Horizon Europe for 25 and also 26 and 27. And this exercise includes the identification and the prioritization of needs originating from policy, but not only, to be covered by the future work programs. So with this, I thank you all for the participation today. I wish a fruitful discussion. I probably won't be able to attend the entire workshop, but I hope to stay for a while at least to listen and to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valerio. If anybody has any questions, you can use the chat, and I suppose there's also the raise your hand function if you'd like to jump in. Okay, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. Our agenda for today, and we're running a few minutes behind, about 5 minutes. We're going to start off with some of the key Super G project outputs. And for that, we're going to welcome Dr. Paul Newell-Price, who is the scientific coordinator for this project. And then we'll also welcome Professor Lynn Frewer, Professor of Food and Society from University of Newcastle. And she's going to talk about the different stakeholder perspectives and the socioeconomic results in the study. Then we'll have a quick break at around 10:45. And then I'll jump back in and try to give you an overview on permanent grasslands in the context of CAP reform and the new strategic plans in European policy. And then I'll follow that up with giving you some of the feedback that we received in our national workshops. And then also some quick feedback on the responses that we received in the different countries that are here today on the national strategic plans. Then we'll give you a little bit of a longer break at around 30. And then the plan was to hold some breakout rooms, which will last for around 40 minutes. And maybe we get away with just one breakout room, Professor Frewer just suggested. And finally, well, if we only have one breakout room, we'll just continue the discussion towards 12:25 and continue for as long as needed. And we're scheduled to end at 1 at the latest. With all that said, thanks again for joining us, and I'm going to turn the floor over now to Paul.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. So it's my job to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the natural science work that's been going on during the project. My talk entitled Sustainable PG Systems. We'll just start off with a short definition of what we're talking about. So next slide, Eric. So yeah, we're talking about, in terms of the overall project, it's about developing sustainable permanent grassland systems and policies across Europe. But what do we mean by permanent grassland in this context? So we've used this definition across the whole project. So it's any land dominated by grasses or herbaceous forage that can be grazed, mown, and has not been included in the crop rotation of a holding for 5 years or more. So using that definition, it does cover quite a wide range of circumstances. So everything from alpine meadows that have probably never been cultivated to some fields that have been in, say, a high output dairy system and might be renewed every sort of 10 years or so. So it does cover quite a wide range of circumstances. So in terms of the project itself, this slide just gives you an overview. In terms of the aim of what we're trying to achieve, we're looking to co-develop, so that's working with farmers, advisors, policymakers, to co-develop sustainable permanent grassland systems and policies that will be effective in optimizing productivity, so producing meat, milk, and other products, but also supporting biodiversity and delivering a number of other public goods and services. And I'll say a bit about those goods and services, or ecosystem services, in a minute. So we're looking at optimizing how permanent grassland performs within farming systems dominated by grassland, but also within other systems where permanent grassland plays a role but may not dominate. And today, really, we're focusing on, if we look at the methodology, we're focusing on the evidence reviews and the expert elicitation work and a bit of modelling that we've done, particularly around the sort of first outcome of better understanding the importance and functioning of permanent grassland. And then Lynn will say a little bit about the research that we've done to understand farmer and citizen concerns. And this is all the sort of evidence that we've produced really to support this development of policies that support the optimal management of PG. And we could discuss a bit what we mean by that. So it's about permanent grassland, it's about delivering a range of ecosystem services. If we look at the next slide, please, Eric. So in terms of the ecosystem services we focused on in this project, I'll start at top left. We're looking at, sorry, last slide, yeah. So top left, we're looking at biodiversity and the pollinator service that permanent grasslands provide. And second along is a dung heap representing climate regulation, so soil carbon, ability to store carbon and potentially sequester it in some grasslands, but also moderating greenhouse gas emissions. Top right represents ability to provide clean water, so supporting water quality. Bottom right is this provision of meat and milk and other livestock products and biomass. Bottom in the middle is a scene not too far from where I am today in northeast England, Weardale, representing landscape, aesthetics and recreation. And then bottom left is the ability of permanent grassland to support protection from flooding and erosion. So those are the ecosystem services that we are focusing on, but the ability of permanent grasslands to deliver those services is under threat from a number of pressures. And some of these pressures are existential, so in terms of abandonment, but also conversion to forestry, conversion to temporary grassland, or conversion to arable land. Other pressures relate to where we still have permanent grassland. It's under pressure from heat or drought stress, from end deposition, intensification, but also to some extent extensification. And in terms of the existential threats, we can probably add conversion to urban land as well. And this is just a bit of work we did in an early part of the project, looking at the percentage area of permanent grassland that is under great threat, small threat, or no threat from these different pressures. So quite a lot of pressure that permanent grassland is under. Next slide. Thought it was just useful to set the scene in terms of the amount of permanent grassland that we have across Europe, and there's quite a variety. And if we look at it in terms of an average cover, it's around 34% of the utilised agricultural area, but we know that has reduced over recent decades. We can see on the graph on the left that just in terms of the total area in each country, there's a huge variation. That's partly down to the size of the countries, but also partly down to how each country reports their permanent grassland area. And on the right-hand side, we have permanent grassland PG represented as a proportion of agricultural area. And again, there's a large variation there. So everything from less than 10% of the agricultural area to almost 100% in some countries. So we know we've got a good idea of how much PG there is across Europe in the different countries, and we also understand what's happening in terms of trends. And we know that there has been a general reduction in permanent grassland area across Europe over the last few decades. The chart on the right, put together by Stanislav Hajduk at Mendel University, shows how in most countries it has declined since 1970, in some cases quite dramatically, in others not quite so dramatic. And in some countries such as Slovakia, it's fairly stable, but on the whole, a general decline. A bit of fluctuation from decade to decade, but on the whole, a general decline. So this is a general trend that we're trying to sort of work against in terms of protecting the permanent grassland, the carbon it stores, and the other ecosystem services it provides. So that's the picture in terms of total area of permanent grassland, but we know that not all permanent grassland is the same, and it varies a lot in terms of its condition, its quality, its management intensity, and the ecosystem services that it can deliver. So as part of this project, we've looked at developing a new PG typology that's not designed to replace any existing typology. So, for example, we've got the European Nature Information System habitat classification, which is a very useful classification to define some of our more ecologically valuable grasslands. This new PG typology doesn't replace that, it just complements it in terms of providing more information in terms of how the permanent grassland, or each permanent grassland, is managed. So we have different levels, and we've split up PG in terms of whether it's managed or not, so whether it's on a trend towards abandonment, remaining as permanent grassland, or succession to non-PG, normally forest. If it's managed, we've got this split between whether it has woody cover or not, and whether it's dominated by trees or shrubs in terms of that woody cover. So those are some of the wooded pastures that we have in areas such as the Montado in Portugal and Dehesa in Spain. And then for those grasslands that have little or less than 10% woody cover, we split it in terms of the renewal interval. So we have the grassland that's renewed less every 15 years or less, which tends to be more intensively managed in terms of cutting, grazing, amount of nitrogen used, number of cuts. And then we have this grassland that is renewed less frequently, which is then split down into a high, intermediate, and low intensity. And then for the intermediate and low intensities, we split it into productive region and marginal region, and whether it's predominantly cut or grazed. So this gives us a cascade of 18 different permanent grassland types, which differ in terms of their ability to deliver a range of ecosystem services, which I'll come on to later. And they also, there are a range of different attributes which to some extent determine which type of permanent grassland we have. So on to the next slide. Having looked at the range of PG types, we've had an attempt at actually mapping these out across Europe based on the different attributes, biophysical limitations of management, but also databases in terms of fertilizer practice and local knowledge in terms of the range of PG types. So this is our initial attempt at mapping out the different PG types, and this is just 2 of the PG types mapped out. So on the left, we have the high management intensity, mostly grazed PG, and we have a legend there showing that this is the percentage of the total land area across Europe. So the yellow parts of the map show where we have less than 3% of the land area is high management intensity, mostly grazed. The dark purple shows where we have more than 18% of the land area of this PG type. So we can see for that high management intensity, it's mainly Atlantic region and parts of the continental region. So it's more the sort of productive part of Europe in terms of its agroclimate. And on the right-hand side, similar map, similar legend, slightly different scale, but this is showing where we have the low intensity PG in a marginal climate. If we just one more click, Eric, just shows that when we're talking about marginal climate, we're basically meaning those areas that are limited by temperature, so generally lower temperature, or limited by summer rainfall, so sort of Mediterranean type climate. And that's the distribution. Our first stab at looking at the distribution of that particular PG type. We have similar maps for the other 16 PG types within the typology. So that just gives an idea of distribution. Just want to say a little bit now about a large body of work that we did within the project to try and understand how permanent grassland compares to other land uses in its ability to deliver a range of ecosystem services. So this was an integrated systematic review, looked through thousands of papers and found 696 papers of relevance. And we looked at 3 land use contrasts, so permanent grassland compared to cropland, compared to temporary grassland, and compared to forest, an ability of 2 different land use comparisons to deliver the range of ecosystem services you see along the bottom. And then in terms of management contrasts, we looked at where we have permanent grassland, what effect does nitrogen input have on the delivery of the ecosystem services, but also what effect does grassland renewal, cutting and grazing frequency, number of species, and legume use have on that delivery. So we'll just look at some of the outputs from that systematic review, report in the paper that's just been shown there. So first of all, just looking at a couple of the land use contrasts. So on the right hand side, we have a donut, green outer and orange inner. And the blue dots represent the comparison between permanent grassland compared to cropland. So, and around the outside, we have a number of different indicators which indicate the ability to deliver the different ecosystem services. So the blue dots, permanent grassland compared to cropland, the blue dots that are towards the sort of green outer part of the donut show where permanent grassland is favourable for the indicator compared to cropland. And we can see there that compared to cropland, PG are as good or better at delivering most ecosystem services. Notable exceptions are yield and energy, with the blue dots towards the centre of the orange part of the donut. Similarly, for permanent grassland compared to temporary grassland, the orange dots, again, where the orange dots are towards the outer part of the donut, that shows that permanent grassland is favourable for the indicator compared to temporary grassland. And so compared to temporary grassland, PG are as good or better at delivering all the ecosystem services that were studied in the papers that we could find. So PG good for a number of different ecosystem services. And the next slide, we had a look at the management contrasts. So here we have 3 of the management contrasts we looked at. So the effect of grassland renewal in the blue dots, the effect of increased defoliation frequency, so more cutting, green dots, and the nitrogen input, the effect of those, all of those on the different indicators and the ecosystem services. So again, where the dots are closer towards the centre, it's showing that the management intervention is unfavourable for that indicator. Where the dots are towards the outside, the management is favourable for that indicator. So yeah, grassland renewal, we found grassland renewal fairly strong evidence that it increases yield, energy and protein, so good for production, but that grassland renewal can impact water quality and lead to loss of carbon and higher greenhouse gas emissions. Increasing the frequency of cutting and grazing increases protein and energy in grasslands, but decreases yield and can have negative effects on pollinators, threatened species and botanical diversity. And then nitrogen input has clear benefits for yield and protein, so good for food production again, but impacts pollinators, threatened species, botanical diversity, greenhouse gas emissions and water quality. So there's quite a number of trade-offs there in terms of the use of nitrogen. So yeah, we can see that permanent grassland, if it's pushed quite hard, there's a number of different trade-offs. If it's used more extensively, then you can have a range of ecosystem services that are delivered and achieving multifunctionality, as it's sometimes called. Next slide, if we just go back to our PG types again, hot off the press, we've had the results of some expert elicitation work we've done in the project. So building on the integrated systematic review and other research that we've done, we brought experts together to try and score the different PG types in terms of how they deliver, whether they're favourable or not for the different ecosystem services. So for the high man, this is just two examples, again, 2 out of the 18 PG types. If we click on Eric, we see for the high management intensity, mostly grazed, as you might expect, it's good for food production, so very favourable for food production, but you see it compromises the other ecosystem services, so that there's a significant trade-off there in terms of aesthetics, recreation, erosion, flood control, water quality, climate regulation, and biodiversity. If we look at the low intensity and marginal climate, so mostly cut situation, so next click, we see that the marginal climate will limit the animal feed production, not surprisingly, but we have delivery of a good range of other ecosystem services, so more of a sort of multifunctionality type situation. So if we just move on to the final slide, just to conclude, these are the main conclusions from the systematic review, and sort of match up with much of the work we've done looking at functionality of PG. Permanent grassland itself is important, so preventing the conversion of permanent grassland to cropland or temporary grassland secures the provision of multiple ecosystem services. And also intensification of existing permanent grasslands can threaten its multifunctionality, so there are significant trade-offs when we do intensify, not least for climate change. But also being aware that prioritising non-feed ecosystem services comes at a cost for the provision of animal feed. So we have to accept a slightly reduced amount of milk and meat produced. And then along the bottom, multifunctional permanent grasslands are increasingly important in agricultural systems. So both in those farming systems dominated by permanent grassland, but also those systems where PG just forms a small part. We need to protect PG to prevent further decline in the provision of our ecosystem services and the sustainability of our agricultural systems. And we need to look at maybe extensifying to some degree in some places, but looking for that sort of sweet spot of management intensity to sort of optimize delivery of ecosystem services on existing permanent grasslands. That's it. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I'll now turn over to Lynn Frewer to talk about socioeconomic research.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to report on 2 of the streams of research that we've been conducting. One, considering farmers and land managers and the barriers and facilitators to them optimizing their delivery of ecosystem services from their permanent grasslands. And I'm going to contrast that with the views of citizens and consumers who have views about the landscape, but also the food products that they produce. So the overall objectives of the socioeconomic research were to assess socioeconomic facilitators of and barriers to adoption of sustainable PG systems. And we're taking due account of differences between the different biogeographic regions that were assessed in the project, to provide evidence for and develop policy options to support PG management in each biogeographic region, which is part of the process that we're engaged in today, and to maximize research impacts through knowledge exchange and consultation with key stakeholders and end users. Next slide, please. So I'll start with our research focused on farmers and land managers. We conducted a series of interviews, quantitative and qualitative data were collected across the different countries involved in the research. So Czechia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And you can see here that we had a total sample of 273 farms that we visited, and a good distribution between organic, extensive, and intensive farms. Next one, please.
Sure. Just wanted to point out, Lynn, it was Chechnya, not Chechnya.
Yes. So there was a slight error there. Okay, let's move on, please. So if we look at the results of the natural science research, we can see that actually, when we think about delivering different ecosystem services, there's a sweet point where we're delivering an optimization of food and feed. So that would be productivist ecosystem services. Those contribute to environmental regulation and biodiversity. So we don't want to be too extensive if we take this into account, nor too intensive. So getting to that sweet point is hard because it means that some farms will need to change and some will remain the same. And it's the direction of change which is of interest. Next one, please. So here's some data just looking at farmers' intentions with respect to whether they're going to intensify or extensify in the future. And what you can see is that in the UK, for example, there's a trend towards future intensification, whereas in Spain, no change. In Sweden, no change. In Switzerland, there's a trend towards extensification. I'm going to point out, though, this very much depends where you're starting from. So people, farmers, land managers need information about what the sweet spot is in terms of ecosystem service delivery and progression to net zero. They need access to advice and technology to get to that sweet spot. And the big question is, how might this be incorporated into policy? This can be through national agri-environment schemes. We know from our stakeholder research that there's a lot of concern that payments may reflect change rather than maintaining good practices as they are, and that some stewardship schemes are particularly problematic. For example, farmers, land managers have big concerns about public access and payments for biodiversity rather than land use change as such. So what do you measure? Do you measure an outcome in terms of an improved ecosystem service delivery function? Or do you measure, or do you pay for the changes that are made on the farm to get to that outcome, given that the outcome may not be achievable, particularly if we're thinking about biodiversity? Next one, please. Key results. I'm going to give you a very high level summary of what we've been looking at. The current attitudes of PG farmers to farming and ecosystem service delivery. Most of our farmers agreed that permanent grassland systems are important for delivering a variety of ecosystem services, including productivist ones, so providing food and feed for the food supply. Specific prioritization differs between countries. And as I've said, provisioning services are a priority compared to regulatory, supporting and cultural services. What do the public think about PG from a farmer's perspective? So most farmers think that the public value PG for its aesthetic and landscape appeal and the quality of food products and the maintenance of permanent grassland within the landscape. Next one, please. So changes needed to maintain or improve ecosystem service delivery from permanent grassland. Most farmers and land managers related these to improving or maintaining environmental goods or services. And surprisingly, a smaller number of farmers focused on profitability or yield as goods and services to be improved. Many farmers, many land managers were concerned about learning new skills in relation to technological innovations. This was something that acted as a barrier to reaching that sweet spot, if you like. Influencing factors on farmers' decision-making. The top three most highly rated factors, again, farmers' own knowledge and understanding of the relationship between their land and ecosystem service delivery. Farm systems, pragmatic barriers to attaining these goals. And of course, economic factors, profitability, stability, maintaining an income and so on. On average, most farmers plan to continue their current practices into the future to maintain the benefits that they perceive to be important. Next one, please. We also found that the kind of values that the different farmers and land managers had, determined their attitude towards extensification or intensification in the future. Many of them really I would describe as productivists with a focus on food security. They saw themselves as delivering food for their countries, for Europe. And this predicted increased intensification, sometimes extensification if they were worried about food quality issues. I think we have a question here about how does this relate to agri-environment schemes in terms of payments. Farmers prioritized their current land management practice. They thought they were very good. Why should they change? And taking good care of the land on the farm, the tidy farm environment. They prided themselves in good livestock management. Sometimes, and this varied between countries, lifestyle predicted changes. The stage they were in their farming career, for example. Younger farmers were more likely to make changes to their farm. And access to agri-environment schemes as income sources was also correlated to farmers' future PG management intention. So they were obviously trying to not exploit, but access these income sources. And if they made changes to access these sources, that drove their decision-making. And one of the conclusions is that both the financial and non-financial impacts of policies and interventions on farmers needs to be considered before policy-based interventions are enacted. And I just want to point out that the farmers are simply not acting in a rational economic way. They're not only seeking to maximize their income, but see that they have a very important role as food producers. Next one, please. Our systematic review of economic factors indicated that there was a big knowledge gap in relation to tipping points and farmer decision-making. So one outcome is that farmers require financial incentives and technical guidance to trigger positive tipping points in their behavior. However, changes to agri-environment schemes and subsidy programs are needed to deliver more ecosystem services from PG. Personal values, agronomic barriers, and consumer demand for particular foods, high welfare in particular, emerged as important, also drive their decision-making. So land use and management changes should be appropriate, context-specific, and also align with farmer values. And there needs to be flexibility in payments, including stacking of payments, use of appropriate assessment metrics to prevent land and abandonment, and very high or theoretically very low levels of stocking density, again to reach that sweet point where we can optimize ecosystem service delivery. Next one, please. So attitudes, a deeply held mental stance that we all have that connect to preferences for and perceptions, for example, of land or landscape, as well as the way that people attach meaning and value to it. So our work on citizens and consumers consisted again of a combination of focus groups, qualitative work, and a survey, which was rolled out across the same countries as we've included here. And the results of the focus group show that it's quite a complex analysis. I'm not going to go into details on this diagram, but the complexity of citizen and consumer identities is really important when we're considering the acceptability of policies to both citizens and to consumers, citizens who vote or decide about whether a policy is acceptable, and consumers who buy the products that are developed and delivered as a consequence of that policy. Next slide, please. So citizens perceive grassland landscapes positively, their experience of them, they have an emotional response to them, they perceive it to be linked with particular environmental characteristics, they appreciate access, and they associate these landscapes with their cultural identity. And obviously that varies between different countries. Perceptions of problems were related to the reduction in the amount of permanent grassland, their degradation, and farmers abandoning grassland. They appreciated farming for biodiversity, trust in policy and land managers, predicted the acceptability of current practices. Do they trust governments, the European Commission, land managers to do the right thing? There were big differences between different consumer segments in the extent to which they prioritized food production and biodiversity. Land sharing versus land sparing was also a point of contention. So there's a question here about how does policy reconcile different perspectives. Next one, please. Between country differences, increased consumption of sustainably produced meat and dairy products, was this an issue for them? In the UK, consumers showed the strongest intentions to increase the consumption of sustainably produced meat and dairy products. In Switzerland, consumers demonstrated the weakest consumption of these products. There are various factors which drive this decision. Low food involvement and price-sensitive consumers tended to be younger and have lower environmental preservation attitudes in Switzerland and Czechia. High food involvement and health and sustainability conscious consumers perceived higher impact and importance of sustainability attributes in Spain and Sweden. An important point, everywhere, people prioritized animal welfare over environmental sustainability in their food choices. So one suggestion is to create a link between improved animal welfare and extensive production practices which conserve permanent grasslands, and to make sure that that link is very obvious on labelling practices. So link animal welfare and mountain pasture labels, for example. So people start to make that connectivity. Next one, please. There were differences between countries. I've just pulled this out from FAO stat data. You can see that for the countries that we considered in the study, meat consumption is much higher in Spain than for the other countries. And for milk, it's much higher in Switzerland than for the other countries. Next one, please. So one conclusion is that one consumer policy will not fit all countries. Communication needs are different in different countries if the ecosystem service sweet spot is to be attained. Meat or dairy consumption with national food systems may be prioritized differently. Combine animal welfare with sustainability labeling. How are labels guaranteed? Transparency in assessments are needed to gain trust. So to make sure that effective traceability is backed up with good information about how these issues are assessed. So animal welfare or pasture bred animal products or eco labels. Next one, please. So my final slide here, because I can see Eric waving. Different people want different things. The tidy landscape versus landscape restoration, provisioning versus environmental conservation, access versus concerns about destructive behaviors of the public in relation to landscapes, but also biodiversity, and prioritization of perceived environmental threat versus the need to maintain and secure our food supply. Okay, so that's it. Thank you. I've just got some selected publications there.
All right, that was well done, Lynn. Well done, Paul. A lot to take in. I think it's a good time for a break. So it's now 10:53. Let's meet back right around 11 o'clock. All right, I hope everyone has recovered and is back and very excited for this second half of our webinar today. I just want to start off by saying, what I find most interesting about today are not the answers that we are sharing with you. It's really the questions that you guys will undoubtedly ask us later on, and the different insights that we receive from you. And I just wanted to mention that because this next part that I'm going to talk about, the permanent grasslands in the context of CAP reform and the new CAP strategic plans, and what Paul presented and what Lynn presented, it's mainly just to give you a baseline to see some of the things that we're researching, dealing with, and maybe even struggling with to try to make sense of. So what I tried to do for today, I guess I was the one that drew the short straw in the team, and I'm the one that gets to provide this baseline on understanding the new CAP and European strategy. And I had a friend as I was preparing. He told me a joke, and he said, Eric, there really are only two people in the world that understand the Common Agricultural Policy. That's the one who wrote it and the one who accidentally clicked, I've read and understood the terms and conditions. And I don't know who wrote it. Maybe it's somebody that's here today. So by all means, feel free to fill in gaps in my knowledge, because I don't think I've ever worked as hard in my life to try to understand a policy. But I did my best. And what I tried to do was I tried to follow the money and what might be the different driving factors that are leading farmers to do a better job managing their permanent grasslands, to be more sustainable in their delivery of ecosystem services and whatnot. So my understanding is that the Green Deal, the Europeans' new Green Deal, is what's really behind the new Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy, which in turn leads to different targets that the CAP is willing to fund. And here are a few of them that I thought were in part related to permanent grasslands and the things that we're discussing today, such as 50% reduction in the overall use of pesticides, certain reductions in nutrient losses, soil fertility, so on and so forth. Of course, the objectives that are part of the CAP, the 10 different objectives, each country, as they're developing their new strategic plans, needs to base what they're doing on in terms of certain objectives. And the ones that are especially important, I think, for the discussion today are the objectives related to things like climate change action, environmental care, preserving landscapes, and biodiversity. And you can see on the right here, on the figure on the right, the left is sort of the old CAP and how it worked. And on the right, you have the new CAP that has some of the virtues of the new CAP that's been touted as increased flexibility by moving money from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. It gives member states the ability to deliver on some of the strategic objectives and the intentions that they find relevant for their unique conditions. So it's the first year, starting in 2023, that the new strategic plans have been adopted, and there are already some people that are starting to try to understand whether or not the new drafted plans are going to be effective. And I guess we're already starting to get some data at the end of 2023 to see how well the different countries are in terms of their objectives with the CAP. And one of these studies that I found very interesting was one done by BirdLife International, when they surveyed a number of different experts and asked them to talk about how well the CAP plans are doing. And this is one of the figures they had in their report. And when it comes to the protection of grasslands, as you can see, there are a lot of countries that given what they're planning to do and their plans, they're already projecting that the results are going to be very poor. My country that I'm representing today as well is Sweden. It's been given mixed results, and only really the Czech Republic and Finland seem to have a plan that's going to deliver good results. And I think this is interesting as a background, because we've done some webinars in Czech Republic, in Sweden, in Spain, and we have some resonations from the people there. If we look at overall and comparing the different countries that I'm going to focus on today, Czechia, Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden, some of the things that the national plans are projected to do and not do well are things like protecting nature. It's projected to be very poor in Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden, and maybe some mixed results in Chechnya. Or sorry, I made the mistake again. In Czechia, and the indicator that they use to base that on is the R34 indicator. Let me look that up again. Well, I'll come back to that in a few slides. When it comes to protecting grasslands, as I already mentioned, Czechia is expected to have good results. Slovenia mixed, Spain very poor, Sweden mixed. And this is based off sort of the indicators and things like GAC, in particular GAC 1 and GAC 9. They're already seeing that when it comes to biodiversity and climate action, there isn't enough money at the moment to ensure that the voluntary measures that are in place are going to be successful for improving biodiversity and whatnot. And another thing that they covered that I thought was very interesting that we'll also touch upon later involves the democracy of the whole new CAP strategic plan development and the inclusion of different stakeholders in developing these plans. And in each country, there were mixed results when it came to that. Okay, so I of course tried to understand in the strategic plans what kinds of things were the different countries looking at in terms of indications that they were doing a good job delivering on farm to fork biodiversity strategy and whatnot. And one of the first things that jumps out, of course, is just how different each country is in meeting different indicators. I think there are a total of 44 indicators. And if I recall correctly, each country has to have at least 27 different indicators as part of their strategic plans. And if you look at R34, as I promised I'd come back to, the utilized agricultural area that's under commitments for managing landscape features is one of these indicators. And as you see, even though they're still quite different, for example, Sweden has no plans whatsoever to try to improve in that area, whereas Czechia, Slovenia, and Spain have very low ambitions. And if you read sort of some of the baselines and some of the things that BirdLife and other environmental groups say needs to happen, we need to have at least, let's say, 10% improvements, or for example, utilized agricultural areas under commitments if we're going to, prevent the loss of biodiversity and these types of things. So that, to me, I thought right away was extremely interesting. Just this flexibility that we talked about is, of course, a good thing according to the stakeholders we talked to. But my personal opinion, looking at this, it's the fact that each country can pick and choose which ones they want, I think it might be a problem. Okay, so as I said, I was trying to follow the money, and this was definitely not easy. If the person who wrote the CAP plan is here today, feel free to jump in and correct me. But one of the main sources of influence when it comes to permanent grasslands is this GAC, the increased enhanced conditionality. And under this GAC, it says that member states are obliged to ensure the maintenance of a 2018 ratio of permanent grasslands in relation to agricultural area at a national, regional, sub-regional level. And just the countries that we're talking about today, I tried to get the figures for them, and you can see in Czech, they have a goal of maintaining this ratio at 28%, Slovenia at 59%, Sweden only 17%, and then Spain is regional. And as I mentioned, each member state can choose whether or not they want to have this ratio based on the entirety of the country as a ratio or based on specific regions. So I went a little bit more into depth, and this is something that I showed. I apologize that part of it's still in Swedish, but this is one of the things that I showed in the Swedish webinar, and I was curious to see how well was Sweden doing in terms of meeting this GAC requirement. Betasmark, that means, just generic term for grasslands, and that's the most common type of grassland that we measure. And if you just look from 2018 to 2022, there's been no change or no reduction in grasslands in Sweden. And I think the GAC also states that countries can diverge from this by up to 5% as a maximum. But Sweden seemed to do a pretty good job between 2018 and 2022. And in some areas, like with what's called slåttereng, and translating these terms is by no means easy. I believe this is, pasture lands where animals graze. And I see that Anne Norderhaug is here. Maybe she could correct me on that. But overall, it looks like Sweden is doing fairly well. I then was curious to see, what happens if Sweden had taken a different perspective and tried to base their GAC principle on a regional level. And looking at the different counties in Sweden, how well are they doing? And here you can see that some regions are doing worse than others. And for example, number 24, you have Västerbottens län, and they've seen a reduction of 6% in grasslands. And others have done better, some worse. And I thought that this was an indication that, maybe, we need to have the discussion on whether or not it makes sense to have a national, to base this ratio on a national level rather than at a regional level, because, some of the areas where we see the bigger decreases, like Stockholm, like Uppsala, these are places where there's a lot of urbanization. Västerbotten, I guess, kind of belies that logic because they're a little bit more rural. And I was hoping that this would be the end of things when I presented to our Swedish stakeholder group, and they jumped down my throat, and they really questioned, why are you looking at 2018 to 2022 when, if you go back even further, just as far as 2003, we've lost so many important grasslands in Sweden, and there's not much being done about this. And it seems to be that, do we accept that this 2018 level is a good level? Okay. Another GAC that seemed very important to me as I was reading through this is the GAC 9, which deals with a ban on converting and plowing permanent grasslands in Natura 2000 sites. And you see that there's a difference, in this slide between different member states, depending on how many hectares of grasslands they have. And it looks at which ones are sort of maintained under Natura 2000. And you can kind of get a feel for what it looks like in the different countries, including Sweden. The total area indicative that's environmentally sensitive and permanent grasslands covered. In Sweden, for example, it's around, 33,000 hectares. You can also see that compared to other countries, Sweden has a lot fewer percentage-wise of grasslands, for example, that are covered under Natura 2000. So again, this is one of these things, one of the main levers that we have to control, the cross compliance and the things that these farmers have to comply with vary quite considerably across countries. Okay, another area that that CAP, I understand, uses to try to get voluntary compliance and get people to do additional things are these different eco schemes. And here again, BirdLife has another report where they talked about the different eco schemes, and they focused on two different types of eco schemes when they classified them. First, they talked about eco schemes that deal with climate mitigation, and they talk about in their report how farming and animal farming, it's one of the leading causes of climate change and GHG gas emissions. And it looked at sort of what is being done in that area. And they had a few, I think, interesting things to say in the report. So for example, very few of the eco schemes that are proposed across the EU member states actually go towards mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Again, the other types of eco schemes that they looked at were those that had relevance for biodiversity protection and restoration. And there were more in terms of biodiversity and protection and restoration, a lot of them dealing with fertilizer usage and pesticides and whatnot. And I wanted to kind of also get a feel for what was going on at a member state level. So I went in and I said, okay, so what's actually happening in Slovenia, for example? What are they doing in terms of eco schemes that are related specifically to permanent grasslands? And of course, BirdLife also gave us an assessment of whether or not their eco schemes are actually going to deliver on their promises. And Slovenia overall was rated quite poorly, but there were other countries that received much worse evaluations. So, at least for Slovenia, the money that's being used to encourage voluntary compliance, oftentimes it's done with things that are either not going to work, or the report talks about things that are kind of very easy to comply with, but really not moving the needle. On the other hand, Sweden, of course, apparently is doing exceptionally well with their eco schemes in terms of having eco schemes that are going to deliver on what they promise. The problem I see when I look at Sweden is very few of the eco schemes that Sweden has proposed have to do with grassland management and the things that Paul talked about. What is good quality grassland? What are the ecosystem services we want to prioritize? And again, Sweden has very little in their budget that's specifically directed towards this. Okay, so again, it was a real challenge, as I've already mentioned, trying to get a grasp of. Sorry, my mouse is kind of going crazy. It was a real challenge trying to get a grasp of the CAP and the national strategic plans. And as I said, one of the things I was trying to do was find the money and see, at the end of the day, how much is each farmer getting to manage a hectare of land. And what I found was that, a lot of the information was available, but it was only available, at least that I found, in the national languages. So this right here, for example, is from the Swedish Board of Agriculture, and it's available in Swedish. And it talks about the requirements for land types, and it talks about which grassland types are supported, what kinds of management requirements are needed in order to get paid, and then what kind of special requirements will get you paid extra. And then on the right-hand side, it showed the compensation per land type. And I quite frankly was not able to find, other countries that I wanted to compare with, just because it was, hidden behind a language that I didn't speak. Okay, so anyways, this is just sort of a background of some of the things that I was looking at when I was trying to understand the new strategic plans and the differences. And then we moved into the stakeholder webinars. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the national strategic plans. I'll talk about that in a few slides. Okay, so some of the reflections and some of these points, this isn't everything, obviously. It was a long seminar. We had a lot of interesting things to discuss, but I tried to pull out some of the more interesting things that I didn't expect when we started the webinar. One of the first things that I was really caught off guard by, and luckily my colleague tipped me off ahead of time, was something relating to the definition of permanent grasslands. And what was explained to me by the other Swedes at the meeting was Sweden doesn't have any permanent grasslands. At least by the Swedish definition, there is no such thing as a permanent grassland in Sweden. So this, of course, led to a lot of discussion on, how we define grasslands in Sweden and how it should be defined. And I think the agreement in the group was that they were also confused about the definition that Swedish uses for grassland, which has a lot of very important implications for who can be subsidized for managing it in effective ways. They didn't want to lose control, of course. They like this increased flexibility in the national plans, but they seem to wish that Sweden had a more detailed definition, perhaps something more similar to what's used at the EU level or even the Super G level. Especially if they want to increase, specific types of grassland management, like hay cultivation. Sweden needs to adopt a more standardized definition. As I mentioned, this is slightly related to the definition of grassland. There's a big discussion on what the right reference period is when it comes time to abatement. How far should we go back? Should we be satisfied with 2018, or should we look to go further back? Because a lot of the grasslands in Sweden disappeared almost overnight simply because of a change in what was classified as a grassland and was eligible for payments versus those that weren't. There are also some issues when it comes to grasslands where they talked about, just things that to me in my ears seem very petty. Even a minimal presence of trees or shrubs can lead to the reduction or no support whatsoever. And this is a problem because if things that are important for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, if they're not classified as grasslands, they don't bring support, and that leads to farmers not supporting them, not letting their animals graze there. And then they lead to disappearance and abandonment, and that's a big problem. I think the most surprising thing to me, in our webinar, we had farmers, we had a representative or two of citizen groups, of environmental agencies, and the biggest surprise to me in Sweden was that all of the stakeholders agreed that we need more ruminants, we need more cows in Sweden. And I think the argument is that you can't separate grassland management from animals. If we reduce the amount of cows in Sweden, we're not going to be able to manage the grasslands. And that to me was surprising. And the environmental representative talked a little bit about this and said that a lot of the pressure that their group receives is by stakeholders that say they want to reduce the amount of cows and beef and the food system, but they're singularly focused on climate issues, and they talk much less about issues of biodiversity, carbon, and other issues. So one of the things that this person suggested was that we really need to educate the population on how land relates to ecosystem services. Of course, compensation is too low, and I think this is a theme that crosses every stakeholder group we've talked to. In Sweden, there's been a lot of improvement, and some grasslands have been differentiated, but they're still too low compensation to cover the rising costs and all the increased conditionality requirements. There's a theme as well about targeting support. So there's an issue about, it was talked about a few times that we need to connect animals to pastures and the land in a different way. And one of the problems is, they raised was preventing the capitalization of the support that's paid to landowners who don't have animals. And they think that it should go to people that actually work in animal husbandry. And they gave the example that many of these landowners that don't have animals, that they just keep the support and use it to maintain fences. They might do a few small things, cutting grass just to be eligible for payments, and the grasslands are not very healthy. And one of them said that another problem is that they get to graze their animals for free on some lands, and sometimes they get paid for doing it. The problem, of course, is that there's no consistency in terms of how this is managed. Okay, yeah, there was also issues about targeting support. Our stakeholders felt that support should go to the people that actually manage the animals in the farms. But there's also problems with targeting support for, let's say, smaller farms, farmers that are in industries that are not prioritized. So that's a problem with targeting. And then, of course, another big issue was they need guidance on trade-offs. One of them was talking about, agree or disagree, but they raised the point about, today there's this push on some regulations where they have to preserve a specific species. I think they even called it an insignificant little, species. And that takes priority over a lot of other very important ecosystem services and things like habitat preservation. So anyways, and at the end of the day, it led to worse all around grasslands because of certain trade-offs that were decided. Okay, so those are just some of the things that stood out to me in Sweden. Now I've got this slide on Spain, and I'll be honest, I'm more or less going to read this. I've asked the Spanish team to present this themselves, but they unfortunately have a poor internet connection. So maybe if something needs to be explained, they can jump in, but I'll try my best here. So the first thing that stood out to the Spanish team was, and keep in mind, they're focused in our project on a specific region in Spain called the Dehesa. And again, they have a problem with the definition of things, and the Dehesa definition is related to agricultural or forest-based plus cattle. And the problem is that their definition collides with different cap measures. Sometimes the Dehesa includes permanent grasslands and goes into permanent grassland measures, but at other times, Dehesa is related to forestry and forestry measures. When it comes to sustainable management in the Dehesa, this is also a theme that I'll talk about in the next slide. It depends on the type of stakeholder, and most of the stakeholders, I would say probably in Sweden as well, when you solicit responses from stakeholders, they tend to focus on a very narrow set of things that they're interested in. And in their case, they focused on only one or two dimensions, depending on which interest they represented. Another issue is how to manage the Dehesa. Who's in charge of the policies regarding the Dehesa in permanent grasslands? And this also is partly related to the definition of it. You talked about agricultural versus forest domains. Because the Dehesa collides with two completely different administrations, this creates a lot of barriers and handicaps what they're doing. So there's a strong demand for simplification of the administrative process and the bureaucracy. And I can wholeheartedly agree with that demand right there. There are also some threats they talked about, and of course, they're the same threats that we talked about in Sweden. There's a problem with abandonment, lack of renewal among farmers. The younger farmers have a hard time getting into farming, especially farmers with cows, for example. In the Dahija, they don't value products that come from the Dahija, market conditions. They have a difficulty competing. And again, this is a theme that crosses most of the farmers that we've talked about, that it's very difficult to be green if you're in the red, so to speak. All right, and then they also talked about some instruments and design that I think you can read about more. Okay, same issue with, unfortunately, Czech. They also have a poor internet connection, so I'll try to summarize what this stakeholder webinar, what stood out to our team. The first thing is policy implementation issues. There's a big debate about capping first pillar payments for big businesses and redirecting to smaller ones. And I understand that, yeah, they discussed this quite in depth. The large enterprises believe that they can make better use of support and manage larger areas, and they're better at administrating and utilizing resources. Renewal is also a problem. There's little flexibility or willingness by the state to accommodate farmers, according to them. So, for example, the issue of soil carbon recovery and sequestration should be addressed. 2-year renewals are required, and it would probably be necessary to cultivate and fertilize properly for 2 years so that permanent grasslands would be viable and can fulfill the erosion of other functions that they're supposed to fulfill. They feel that permanent grasslands look like an unwanted child, whom one does not really know what to do with. They have obligations to maintain the ratio of permanent grasslands on the one hand. There's a feeling on the other that the state, through their politicians, administrators at various levels, are basically saying, why should they be supported? Erosion is also an issue in Czech Republic that's not being addressed at all. Okay, so there are challenges as well in administration and coordination, interpretations of rules, mowing fallows. Farmers don't want to enter extension programs because it doesn't make economic sense or it doesn't make ecological sense. So they, of course, feel that, again, this is very common. I'm sure everybody working in Brussels has heard this before. A simplification of the rules and flexibility is desperately needed. Finally, they talked a lot about the threats, and farmers, of course, are divided in their opinions. On the one hand, the productivist conception of managers of large enterprises is contrasted with the effort to return to sustainable farming in the countryside and soil care. Okay, I'll leave this there. I've got a few other slides. So this was also very complex data. I think I had 50 pages of transcripts to go through and try to extract themes. And if you haven't tried it yet, I would strongly suggest checking out artificial intelligence to help you thematize and understand patterns in your data. And I wish I had done this for understanding the CAP. But I used artificial intelligence to try to distill the common themes across the different countries. And here we're also including the UK now. And the common themes discussed at the webinars were definitions and recognition of unique ecosystems, challenges in administration and coordination, the threats to sustainable management, policy design and instrumentation, and ecosystem services and the payments related to them. The differences that we talked about, so each country talked about some slightly different things related to geographical and landscape variations. So for example, in Sweden, there was an emphasis on diverse landscapes affecting grassland classification, whereas in Spain, the focus was on a very unique ecosystem, i.e. the Dahija. Of course, the specific local challenges, as you probably would guess, they were very different across the webinars, as were the implementation issues for policy and the specific policy recommendations. All right, I also said that I wanted to talk a little bit about reflections on about the CAP strategic plans. And what we did was a few weeks ago, as we were discussing sort of the webinars, we came across this wonderful CAP dashboard, and we got really excited about it in our group because it really enabled us to compare, you know, where the money was coming from, what the strategic objectives were, and whatnot. And part of what we're doing going forward is we're going to use that to really understand some of the differences. But in doing that, what was also very interesting was learning more about how the process unfolded when it came to developing the national strategic plans. And I think this is a very important thing that the European Union does, that they require countries to involve stakeholders and get a broad representation of different interest groups. And I mentioned the result from BirdLife, how they talked about the involvement of stakeholders was very mixed. And right away we found this gold mine of information, or at least we thought we did. So in Sweden, what I found extremely commendable was that I believe it was the Board of Agriculture, they released the documents that anybody can go and look into, and it very succinctly summarizes all of the different stakeholder interest groups that sent a letter in towards the national strategic plan. So just before the strategic plan was approved, the stakeholders could all say what they wanted to say and complain and talk about what they wanted to complain about. And I assume that this process would be the same for all of the countries. So Spain and Czech and Slovenia, they went and they also tried to summarize and get this data. And what we found quite quickly was that there were a lot of differences across countries in terms of how transparent or how easily accessible this information was. And I'm not going to point out any country names for now, but just know that I think this is one of the things that definitely has some policy implications. On the one hand, it's important to get the different stakeholders. On the other hand, I think the results of this work needs to be more easily accessible. Okay, so what are some of the reflections that we had when we went through the stakeholder feedback? Similar to what we found in I believe it was the Spanish webinar, stakeholders tend to represent their core interests. So, you know, the WWF talked about the environment, BirdLife talked about biodiversity. And I thought that was unfortunate because, you know, in my experience, the only people that really tend to have a holistic approach are the farmers. But of course, they have their own interests as well. So it'd be nice if these stakeholders could take a more holistic perspective, but they didn't seem to, at least in their criticism of the strategic plans. I think that the criticism, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but the criticism that I read, it's rarely directed towards the efficiency of what's been suggested in the strategic plans. And by efficiency, I'm talking about the cost benefit of each thing. You know, it's more likely than not, the critique is, you know, we should do more of this or more of that, but not, you know, how much is it going to cost and is it worth doing? Something I found extremely fascinating, and I think the most transparent data I had was from Sweden. So this result might just be related to Sweden, but in Sweden at least, I found it fascinating that the responses, so the people that had an issue with the National Strategic Plan were pretty much only the environmental groups and the special interest groups. They were definitely overrepresented. When it comes only to grasslands, you know, the other groups were represented when it came to other issues, but specifically issues related to grasslands, it was mostly the environmental groups and special interest groups. Okay, and why do I point this out? I think, you know, I believe that policy effectiveness depends on a few things. So one, it depends on relevance. You know, is there a coherence between the problem and the policy objectives? And I think we've learned from our stakeholders that there is at times a lack of coherence. Of course, efficiency is also important. You know, at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for it. And, you know, is there a good cost benefit? At least the stakeholders, they don't talk in terms of cost benefit, at least the ones that I've spoken with. Democracy is also very important, whether the policy influenced or meets the needs of stakeholders. And here we see clear examples of, you know, the national plans not being as democratic as they could be. And some countries maybe are more democratic in this process than others. And all of that, I think, together leads into legitimacy, whether or not there's support from the stakeholders for the policy. And there were some examples of stakeholders that they gave to us where, you know, they just, you know, if there's a requirement or a regulation out there, they'll just ignore it if they don't believe in it. Okay, here's, I won't go through this. I think I've talked a lot about this, but I also used AI to kind of look at critique and look at different patterns in the letters that were sent into the different national governments. Another source that I didn't include in this presentation, but I hope to include it for our presentation in February is, I think what a very interesting discussion, if you haven't had a chance to read it, is looking at the EU's comments on the national plans and reading the national, each member state's response to these plans. And I was really surprised that, you know, some of the responses were, well, we're just going to do it our way, is my interpretation. And somehow they got their way. But anyways, I'll leave it there for now, and hopefully by February, I'll have something more to talk about in that regard. Okay, well, how am I doing on time?
It's 10:42.
Yeah,
Eric.
or 11:42.
11:42 in CET.
Okay, so I think we're doing excellent on time. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. And when we get back, we'll do we might do breakout sessions. I'll talk to the team and see if we can handle this in one group. I think it'd be more interesting if we can, but we'll let you know in 10 minutes. So it's 11:43 now. Let's meet back at 11:45. Thanks.
You mean 11:55?
Yeah, 11:45 would be cheating you. Let's do 11:55.
11:55, great.
Perhaps you don't have a quick internal meeting about the next bit. So we were scheduled to finish at 11:30, so we're 5 minutes late. That's all okay.
Yeah, we'll be starting 15 minutes late, won't we?
Yeah, so that's good. I mean, my suggestion is not to have the breakout groups, because otherwise it might be, it might be more discussional if we have folks in the same room.
Yeah.
So do you want to discuss here in an open way?
Yeah.
I think so, because I think we have maybe up to 6 external people.
Okay, for me it's okay.
They'll
So I'll let you
be drawing comments from them,
all right.
really. Yeah.
Okay.
So that means one person has to step down as chair, and I'm happy to do that. And that I can't remember who the other chair was.
I was the other chair, Lynn. So I'm
You want
easy
to
either way.
chair it, or yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And then we need a rapporteur as well.
I'm
Yeah.
recording, so it's okay.
But then we'll have a rapporteur because we need someone to report back at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, because we had Eric or me as taking notes. Should we both do it just in case, or?
Well, I'll sit in as well. But Verena, why don't you take the notes and report back
Perfect.
for
Okay.
session, and then
Yeah.
the rest of us. I mean, we could always chip in with extra questions if anything came up.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say the power's gone a bit flaky here. So if I disappear, it wasn't just that I thought Paul would be the better chair, that of course he would be. I'm a bit worried about disappearing mid breakout session, as it were, so mid discussion session.
Okay.
But
So
I'll certainly take notes.
so I'll chair, and then I suppose it's useful to have a sort of brief summary session from the rapporteurs. We can still have that report back session, can't we? Just to summarize.
It's just a summary,
But that might not take quite as long as we were thinking.
but that's okay because we're running late anyway.
Exactly. So so we could really go on till we could basically just use the 45 minutes again, couldn't we?
Well, 4 questions. So
Yeah.
I sent them round in an email, so you've got them separate from the presentation.
Yeah, I've got the 4 questions. So we basically, if we restart at 11:55 European time, we can go until 12:40,
Yes,
and that still gives us 20 minutes to wrap up.
and also because we won't have a breakout session, so we will be just one group.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's okay. So we are just coming into time. So
Yeah, it's perfect, isn't it? It's all worked out well.
so
Good.
it's okay.
See you in 8 minutes.
Right.
Okay,
I'm just going to check on the power outside to see what's happening.
great. See you in a bit.
Okay. See you.
The time is now 11:55. I think everybody's back and okay. We can start with the breakout groups questions. And we agreed as a team that we're going to try to do this as a single group. And I'm going to hand over the chairing of this to Lynn Frewer.
It's actually Paul that's chairing, Eric, not me.
I'm going to hand over this important task to Paul, who's going to explain the questions and what we're going to do now.
Right, great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks everybody for joining. So yes, we decided to run this as a single breakout group and discussion. And we're aiming to get as much input from our participants from the research sphere and European Commission as possible. So I suppose we've got the 4 questions to go through, and we may be able to cover any other points you have in terms of questions about the presentations along the way, hopefully. But we have 45 minutes for this. We think we can run this until 12:40, 20 to 1 European time, and we'll then have 20 minutes just to sort of summarize and wrap things up. So if we'll go on to the first question then. So we've spoken a fair bit about what permanent grasslands do for us. We talked about the sweet spot and extensification as opposed to intensification, what farmers want, what citizens want, different people want different things, but what should permanent grasslands provide for society? So the first question is, what do we want from the future in relation to the extent and condition of permanent grasslands in Europe? So we have Andreas and Frank, Julia and Michelle, I think, on the call. So would anyone like to start in terms of just some comments about that question? Raise your hand or put your camera on. Okay, so yeah, Michelle, I think the first hand I saw.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for this intriguing and in-depth analysis. And by the way, we are following Super G even for other issues. I think there's a model that you've been developing that is very much of interest to us. So thanks for these inputs. I've been interested in your presentation, but I was interested specifically in certain issues that I would like to raise in this breakout discussion area, let's say, although I can't follow it throughout because I have to leave. There's another meeting, so I will come in and out. So sorry for this. 2 issues I'd like to, well, 3 issues I'd like to raise. 2 are main, and the third is a secondary one. It's been mentioned the issue of the sweet spots where the balance between extensive and intensive management is to be, I mean, the kind of climax, if I understood it well. That's a very interesting concept, and we here try to develop a concept that is somehow similar, because we have, as you might know, in Europe, there's a pressure to downplay livestock figures in general, and those are specifically problems for so-called hotspots, where the intensity of livestock, the density of livestock and the intensity of its management is too high, giving problems to climate and ecosystem dynamics. So the cool spots, on the other hand, would be a concept to take into account areas and regions in Europe where, according to what has been stated here as well, so the need to have animals in order to manage sustainably grasslands, not only livestock, but also labor. That's another issue. We call cool spots the areas where the density of animals is currently lower than what is needed to take into account the need for the hectares to be managed. This is the problem in certain mountainous areas in southern and southeastern Europe, as well as in parts of the Balkans. Of the Balkans, or of the Baltic. The Balkans are not yet much more into the EU, of the Baltic countries. So there's a debate about how many animals are to be accounted for if you want to have a sustainable management of grasslands, and in times where we all are asked to, well, as a European Union, to cut down on animal heads, maybe in certain areas, maybe we should talk about kind of redistributing, because there are areas where the number of animal heads are not the ones that are needed to take into account ecosystem service management. This is one issue. So the idea of cool spots is where do we need more animals and how to get back to the figures that would be relevant to grassland management. An issue that is related and that I mentioned somehow before is the issue of labor, because everywhere we've heard and we know there's a problem of a generational renewal, there's a problem of manpower availability, there's a problem of skills, and there's a problem of technologies. There's not been very much investment in technologies that support extensification or extensive systems. And there's a problem in social recognition as acceptance, as we've seen, not only in the markets, but even in society. And there's a problem of labor force. In very many areas, people looking after the animals are very often not anymore the sons of the livestock breeders, are in areas that I know about is very often migrants with very limited salaries and rights, and they don't take over, they don't remain for long. So there's a sense of precarity into the system that makes it very unattractive to, I wouldn't say just young workforce, but anybody that would be interested in taking over. So there's a problem of generational renewal that is particularly serious and critical in extensive livestock management, in extensive livestock systems. And so these are the two main policy issues. Then there's a third technical issue that has not been addressed into this presentation, is that the big difference between small and large ruminants, because unfortunately we know that CAP subsidies have been supporting to an extent the shift in herd, particularly in Southern Europe, from small ruminants to larger to cattle, basically because the subsidy was much higher. But we know that the implication of having sheep and goats or cattle in terms of grassland management is quite different. So this is a more of a technical issue rather than a policy one. Thank you again. And I disappear, not because I'm disappearing, but because from time to time I won't be able to stay in front of the screen, but I'll try to follow as much as I can. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for that input. Hope to hear from you again soon. So Anne, you had a point on this question?
Yes. Permanent grasslands include many different types of grasslands. And most of them are, or all of them, are important for several ecosystem services. But if we are going to stop loss of biodiversity, it is increasingly important to pay special attention to semi-natural and natural grasslands and to support them especially. Nowadays we are not looking so much for biodiversity, more for ecosystem services as a whole. But we should look more for biodiversity. And this also influences the next question, how to best manage permanent grasslands. That depends on which type of grassland it is. So we should look more at the different types of grassland and what the best management is for the different types, I think.
Thank you, Anne. So you thinking if biodiversity is prioritized or given a focus, then you automatically, or at least to some degree, get delivery of the other ecosystem services simultaneously?
Yes, yes, you do. Carbon sequestration is different in different types of grasslands, concerning on management and climate and different things. But mostly, if you are going to take especially care of grassland with high biodiversity, you also take care of most of the other ecosystem services. But of course, you shouldn't let the other grasslands just go. You should take care of them also. But grasslands with high biodiversity need special management, often more intensive regarding how much you have to do. Not intensive with fertilizers or something, but with work, more working intensity.
Right, thank you. And as I say, in order to deliver, getting this flexible management for different types of PG, you're saying, how best to manage PG for multiple public goods. Well, that depends on the type of the permanent grassland. In that case, we need a suite of different management options that cover the different PG types. So the land managers have that option to choose which management practice to adopt, I suppose.
I think so, yes. And by the way, Slåttereng is hay meadows, semi-natural hay meadows, not
right. Thank you.
Mm.
There you go, Eric. So yeah, moving on to the second question then, and already commented. Anyone else like to comment on this question of how to best manage permanent grasslands for multiple public goods, if that's what we're trying to achieve? If there's no other comments on that one, we can move on to the next question. So, Lynn,
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the kind of conflicts we're getting between, if you like, farm managers, the public, and the way they're prioritizing land use and land use change. And I don't really know how a policy process might accommodate that conflict. And one of the conflicts, I guess, is between land access. Another conflict is between land sharing and land sparing. So if anyone had any thoughts on that, I think that'd be really nice. Otherwise, we could just put that in as a possible issue that needs further consideration, how to reconcile these different perspectives.
Thanks, Lynn. Any comments on that, or the how to best manage PG question? Andrea still on? Frank or Julian? If not, let's move on to the next. Next question.
I think it's really difficult to give you a single answer because there is no single solution. I mean, there's so many different situations and across Europe, and we all tend to think, to look at it from our personal perspective. I think that was also mentioned before. But this is also a geographical issue because there's so many different perspectives geographically. So I would really have difficulties to give a single answer. Maybe I would just like to react to one point. It's this idea of a sweet spot. I don't believe in it. I think it doesn't exist. And in fact, I have more the biodiversity perspective, and I'm aware that in order to achieve very good biodiversity outcomes, you really need to accept a significant loss of productivity compared to what is nowadays the common standard. My experience is that when you try to find compromises, everybody loses, because if you try to find, let's say, to make a certain degree of extensification, you will first start having a significant loss of productivity. And it's only when you go very far and when you are very patient, because it also takes a lot of time to recover diversity, that you can see the results on the ground. So I think there is, the idea of that there is a kind of sweet spot where all the let's say all the services can be achieved at the same time. I think it's a bit an illusion. And the reality is perhaps more that we need to be aware that in order to achieve different objectives, we will need to kind of, I wouldn't call it land sparing or sparing, but you need to be aware that you can't achieve everything on a single plot. And, perhaps at the farm level, there is a way to achieve this by setting aside a certain part of land. But then that doesn't solve all the conservation issues that we have, because sometimes we need really very extensive landscapes. But then these extensive landscapes, they don't provide the levels of productivity that we need. And I think what we need is a vision of agriculture that takes into account both productivity and biodiversity, that is aware that it can't be achieved at the same time. But at the same time, we also need to denounce those systems that are polluting, because at a certain level, intensive farming is fine, as long as it's not polluting. And I think these are the three main elements. And then now we have this other service like the climate stuff that comes in and so on. I think it's creating a lot of confusion there. And the more goals we want to put into the grasslands, the more complex it becomes. And of course, the whole discussion about the negative impact of cattle, I think it's a bit toxic in this respect, because it's clear that for biodiversity, we need livestock. There is no way around. I think we all agree on that. So we have a problem with an increasingly difficult perception in the public about what is actually needed to maintain biodiversity on grasslands, but also that you can't, in the current system, we cannot just assume that we will achieve biodiversity objectives on every piece of grassland. And in fact, there will be perhaps the majority of grasslands will always need to be, let's say, intensively managed to an extent that the delivery in terms of biodiversity is probably rather limited. So I think we need a kind of pyramidal system that with the most extensive systems on top, perhaps covering a lower extent of the grasslands, and the more productive ones on the bottom with a higher share of land. But still, I mean, there is still a lot of things to do in terms of reducing pollution, be it the groundwater pollution to over fertilization, or all the things that we see, especially in Western Europe, where you have these super intensive systems where the grassland is basically just there to dump the manure. That's an unfortunate reality nowadays. So that's a bit my feeling. And of course, that the other point is that I think that's a bit my experience also. Once you don't put fertilizer, you already achieve a lot in terms of biodiversity. And there is certainly things that you can improve in terms of the management regime and so on. And I know there's a lot of constraints sometimes set in the agro-environmental programs. But in fact, a grassland that has never been over-fertilized can always be very easily restored into something of high value for biodiversity, and vice versa. Something that has been over-fertilized or even highly fertilized for a lot of time is almost impossible to restore, depending on the ground, on the soil conditions, of course. But I mean, I'm aware of cases where after decades, we haven't been able to restore the biodiversity on these grasslands because the physical, chemical conditions of the land. So, sorry if I talk too much, but I think this is just to give you a bit of a vision here, and hopefully that replies to some of the questions.
No, thank you, Frank. I'll just come back on the sweet spot point, which I take, and it may be an illusion, but in some contexts, but I think the sweet spot concept acknowledges that you can't be maximizing out on productivity and also achieve for the other ecosystem services. So it's not being able to achieve everything. I think it assumes a certain reduction in productivity in order to achieve the multifunctionality, but that sweet spot will be different for almost every PG type, every field, depending on the specific agroclimatic and soil conditions. But yeah, no, thanks for all those points. Lynn, did you want to come back on anything there?
I think Anne was first.
Anne was okay. Yep. And that's another hand up, I'm assuming.
Oh, sorry, I didn't lower it, but I could say that it's more difficult to restore biodiversity than to take care of still existing biodiversity. And that's why it's so important to take care of those areas existing today in the different countries. The most biodiverse meadows may have more than 80 species on a square meter. And that's important to take care of.
Yes, it depends which aspects of biodiversity we're talking about, because I mean, our experience here is that with bird species, for example, even on some of the more intensive grasslands, we can still do something for some birds, some wader birds, for example. Some people have shown how they can be supported, and we can have breeding success even within grasslands that are managed quite intensively. They do have to accept a certain amount of loss in production because they're delaying cutting in some cases, and they're not really optimizing or maximizing production. But where there's a will, there's a way, even in some of those more intensive grasslands. Lynn?
And that's why it's important to take care of all permanent grasslands, but give a special attention to the most biodiverse.
Thank you. Lynn?
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to come back actually to Frank and to everybody really. So the data are showing that people are much more concerned, both as citizens and consumers, about animal welfare compared to some of these sustainability issues. So that's the first point. I don't know how policy manages that. The second point I wanted to make, just listening to the discussion and slightly being devil's advocate, is doesn't it depend on what biodiversity we want to maintain or restore? Because a lot of our citizens will say, actually, we like wooded land, or we like other systems, other ecosystems. Those are the kind of charismatic ones, or the ones that we're really enthusiastic about. And they don't actually associate permanent grassland with that, if you like, curation of biodiversity. So I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that. This is just the results of, the kind of data that we've been getting from our stakeholders.
Well, maybe I can reply to that. That's in fact that's an interesting reality, that there is a perception that nature is forests, and the open landscape is basically a farm landscape, and there is no value in it. Now, the reality is that a significant part of Europe's biodiversity is linked to open habitats, and in particular to grasslands. I mean, not just plants, also a lot of insects, butterflies. The majority of butterflies is linked to grasslands. There's a lot of ground nesting bird species. And what's also interesting is that when we look at the data, these are the ones that are declining. The forests we have a forest recovery all over Europe for more than a century. And we see that also in terms of species biodiversity. There is more and more deadwood and old trees and so on. And that's really a very positive trend. And at the same time, we see that these traditional farming systems that are being abandoned a bit everywhere, it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain them. And they're either abundant, bluntly, and we see this a lot in Eastern Europe for the moment, being in mountain areas in particular, or intensified and transformed into very intensively managed grasslands, and in some regions of Europe we only have these left, or into arable land or whatever. I mean, there's also the urbanization, of course. So they're squeezed in between everything. It's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain them. But there is overall, there's a lack of the recognition of the biodiversity value of open habitats and grasslands. That's absolutely correct. I think it's also a question of education. Now you say, well, is it a question of value? Yeah, it is, of course. But if we have set ourselves a target to maintain Europe's biodiversity, we have to, of course, to focus on what's really in a worse situation, what's declining, and that's the biodiversity linked to open habitats, and in particular to grasslands. And there is another interesting aspect there. You probably know this concept of shifting baseline. So people tend to be sensitive to what they have seen when they were young, and with every generation the baseline changes. And when you grow up in a Dutch intensive farming landscape, you tend to believe that's nature. Then because it's green, that's what's the problem? So there is an increasing loss of knowledge and sensitivity to what is actually, what is a species-rich landscape, and sometimes nowadays you have to travel quite a distance to see a grassland that is rich in biodiversity, because and then we have the urbanization. More and more people live in cities, are increasingly without contact to nature. So all these kind of things add up, and the perception changes over time. But the reality of which species are in a bad status and declining and disappearing is not changing. That's so there is an increasing divide between the perception and the data.
Yeah. No, I think that's all very true. I mean, my question actually following on from that, and I'm really interested in what you think, is I'm often asked if, we're considering questions of landscape restoration or ecological restoration, how far back do we restore? What are we restoring to? So, we talked about the sweet spot in ecosystem services. How does that relate to an historical perspective of what is the sweet spot going back to our restoration ambitions? And then, added to that, how do you develop a policy to try and catalyze that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but I think we cannot go back to the past. I think there is always the desire to find back these management regimes that have contributed to the maintenance of these, but these management regimes are super intensive in terms of workload. And I mean, compared to our current perception, there might be technological solutions sometimes, but they haven't been found so far. So you probably need to reinvent management systems. And so you see sometimes people who are coming up with new approaches at large-scale grazing systems or something like that. So I think we haven't found the silver bullet for that. So, but I think it would certainly be worthwhile also when it comes to the discussion of how the CAP should be adapted, to think about ways to allow a transition into a system that is I mean, in particular, when it comes to biodiversity, I think there is perhaps something to be done there, to allow, let's say, a farmer to shift into a system that is perhaps delivering more on biodiversity and less on production. But that's something that is extremely difficult, because as a farmer you are bound, by investments. You have a long-term strategy. You have debts, credits running, and you can't just change from one year to the next into a totally different system, and we don't have any tool to allow that for the moment being. So perhaps that could be an interesting idea for the next CAP. Well, it's just an idea,
Yeah, good point about those barriers, those potential barriers. Yeah, any other thoughts about what changes need to be made to protect PG? So moving on to the third question now. So first of all, to protect PG, is PG being protected sufficiently? Or do we need to change things to protect it, but also to support its sustainable management? So first of all, do we have the right approach? We've got potential to use regulation, or we can value PG's existence a bit more so that it's adopted by farmers and protected by farmers if it becomes at least as financially viable as the alternative, which might be ploughing out to arable or putting it into temporary grassland, depending on the circumstances. So yeah, so how do we most effectively protect PG, and then how do we most effectively support farmers to manage permanent grassland sustainably? I mean, it might be policies around education that we've mentioned already. It might be more about labeling it, but it might also be about payment schemes. Any thoughts on that?
So I'm just going to chuck something else into the mix, if that's all right. So one of the things that came out of our citizen work, or actually the farmers really emphasised this, but some citizens mentioned it, that the public should have to pay for access to rural environments, including PG, which would act as a sort of tax to support ecosystem service delivery. And some people got really cross about that, I remember from the focus groups. But I wonder if that's a policy option we should be thinking about.
Public,
it's not feasible. It's not feasible. It's unrealistic. I mean, not just politically, also in practice. How do you want to do this? There's, I mean, unless it would be an extremely rare resource. Then let's say, like an amusement park, you pay an entry ticket, you enter. I mean, is that what we want? Do you want to really confine these to a few limited spots that we could control? And I think this is for many people, this would be a horror scenario.
I think it also depends on your system of whether you have free to roam or access via footpaths, for example, which would be the case in England, but not in Scotland.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is a way forward. It's just that this is something that seemed to get a bit of support with our stakeholders. So it's an idea that's bubbling up. The other issue,
I mean, it works. It works for the national parks because they are rare and locally confined. There's few of them. They have boundaries. They're difficult to access physically.
but many farmers
they're very special. They're special also. I mean, so if really these grasslands would become so special and so rare that they would be confined to a few places, then it would work. But that's not. I think that's not the situation. I think that's not the desirable situation.
Yeah. So that's one of our big points of conflict as well, that farmers and land managers really don't want the public accessing their land full stop.
Is that maybe more a point for improved education in terms of how people behave in the countryside, and that may improve the relationship between the land managers and the people, the public accessing the countryside?
Well, not from this project, but from another project. It's very much linked to the kind of payments that farmers are expecting, land managers are expecting to get. So if you're being paid for increased biodiversity, the worry is that having the public there will potentially disrupt those payments, because the biodiversity will, be not there. Oh, look, Eric's got his hand up.
Eric, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just was thinking I don't know, thought to answer your question. I'm curious what other people think about it. But when I'm reading the different policies and the different goals, it seems that a lot of the endpoints are the things that are supported. We need to ensure biodiversity. We need to ensure climate. We need to ensure certain endpoints. What if permanent grasslands were an endpoint by themselves? Does that make sense? I know that they're subordinate to the other ones now, that they're important because they lead to these things, but is that an avenue to ensure they're better supported? Because right now, what I tried to find was which CAP policies actually directly targeted permanent grasslands, and I struggled to find them. They're always indirectly supporting them. So PG is an endpoint. Is that an idea?
Yeah, in terms of valuing them for the, well, in some cases the biodiversity they support, but in most cases, if not all, the carbon that they store. So yeah, maybe they aren't sufficiently valued. And certainly in our experience, where you do increase the rates of a particular management option, all of a sudden there's better uptake, surprise, surprise. But it's a question of where you pitch it, isn't it? In terms of the payment rates.
So peat is kind of dealt with a lot better than other carbon storage approaches. Yeah.
And
So shall we speak?
yeah. And did you want to come in there?
Yes, grasslands could be the end point, but then it should be best managed permanent grasslands, not just permanent grasslands.
But is there a case for making sure that even the more intensive permanent grasslands that have little biodiversity value currently, should we not be making sure they aren't ploughed out, or is that less of a concern? Given that if they're ploughed out, we stand to lose, half or more of the carbon that they store.
I don't think they should be taken out. But best management is different for different permanent grasslands, and they should be managed in a proper way, all the different types. And then grasslands could be the endpoint.
Well, of course, this is a desirable situation, but the reality is perhaps different. When maintaining grasslands has an opportunity cost for a farmer. He could basically get twice the amount of energy if he would transform it into a maize field, or as fodder maize for cattle or whatever. So assuming that we have limited resources, which is the reality, we need to prioritize. And the question is, what do we want first? Do we want first to maintain the highest possible amount of total area of grassland? Or do we want to prioritize where grasslands deliver particular, like high biodiversity? That's a choice, huh? And I think that from a biodiversity perspective, it would of course make sense to focus first on those with the highest biodiversity delivery. And I wonder there is perhaps the pollution perspective, huh? Because permanent grasslands have an important value in terms of preventing erosion, perhaps also preventing groundwater pollution compared to urban land. So if you take all these into account, you might perhaps come to another conclusion. And again, it depends on the local context. So it's so difficult to make general statements out of this. I think it's And I see that, I mean, I understand that today the discussion is a bit about what is the vision for Europe, huh? Then what do we want to achieve? But yeah, I think we will very much depend on societal choices in terms of how far a society is willing to go in terms of the maintenance of a grassland cover. And the unfortunate reality is that we see increasingly that this is not really valued, and that the loss of sensitivity to the value is both happening for the high biodiversity objectives and for the grasslands in themselves. There is not a big perception that we need to maintain grassland cover.
I just want to clarify, like, I don't think it, instead of biodiversity, it should be, you know, grassland at the top. I think in parallel with biodiversity, climate, this should be one of the key goals by itself, you know, and maybe, as Ann said, it's best management for permanent grasslands. That should be, I'm not saying it should, but just an idea is it, maybe that could be one of the priorities that sits in parallel and level of importance, because it does contain a lot of other biodiversity, a lot of other sustainability aspects under it.
Sure.
Thanks, Eric. Andy, do you want to come back in there?
Yes, we have to prioritize grasslands of importance for biodiversity with regard to compensation, because when you are managing them in a proper way, you get lower yield, and the farmer will lose income, and loss of biodiversity is a big threat, or a big global threat. So we have to stop loss of biodiversity. But also grasslands that are more intensively used, if they are not polluting, could get some compensation, because they are important for instance, carbon sequestration.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah. So last few minutes then, just wanted to just focus on the last question there. So what future research needs to provide evidence for policy? So what evidence do we need for policy in the future? I suppose related to that, if we're producing policy briefs, what are the specific topics that you're interested in? If we're going to produce policy briefs in the last few months of the project. Anyone want to start on that, future research or favorite topic areas? And
we need more research regarding carbon sequestration in different types of grasslands. But evidence for policy, we really need to educate society regarding grasslands and the importance of grasslands, and that they will not be there if we don't have ruminants grazing there. Because many people think that the grasslands will stay there, they are natural, they will stay there anyhow, but they will not. Most of them are semi-natural or part of crop rotation. So it's important to educate society, and not at least politicians.
thank you very much. And any final comment before we end the breakout? If not, I think we can pass back to Eric slightly early. Thank you very much for all your inputs. That's really useful. Back to you, Eric.
Okay. Are you seeing the PowerPoint slides now?
Yep.
All right. So I guess we all know what was discussed in the group, so we can obviously hop over that. I just wanted to once again thank everybody for joining. As we go forward, We're going to summarize the results from today's workshop and share that on our Super G site. We also want to extend an invitation to everybody here. If you want to hear more about our project and the results at the end, you're all welcome to join the final Super G hybrid conference on February 7, 2024. I believe it's in Brussels as well as online. And to join, you just can go to that site and register now.
And we can send the flyer to everybody with the registration link on it.
Yeah. Okay, I don't think we had any more planned for today. Any final thoughts from you, Paul or Lynn?
Yeah, I think Lynn's had to go. She's got an emergency, but I don't know if anybody wanted to do a brief. Was anyone taking notes to do a brief summary of what we discussed?
I did take notes, yeah.
Are you happy to give us a quick summary from your perspective, Irina?
Yeah, I can try. So for the first questions, Michelle was addressing the sweet spot issue, and was mentioning that maybe redistributing is rather the solution in terms of checking which grassland areas can work with which kind of intensities. He was addressing the labor issue, the generational renewal, and the lack of skills, labor, and technology that we have to address. Also, favoring technology that is supporting sustainability. Yeah, and he was mentioning in this regard that the CAP was supporting a shift from small to big unions in terms of subsidies, which should be thought of. Then Anne was taking over, addressing the importance of the different types of permanent grasslands that we have, and the necessity of supporting grasslands that have at the moment a high amount of biodiversity or high value of biodiversity. And that if we take care of the biodiversity, we have a lot of ecosystem services that are included in this, or at least positively influenced. For the second question, in terms of how to manage permanent grasslands for multiple public goods in Europe, there was also Anne with the importance of the type of grassland that we're talking about, and that there will be no one-way solution for all the different types that we have, and that we have to consider all over Europe. Frank was also saying that there's no single solution, and also that the sweet spot idea might not exist or might not be feasible in reality. Yeah. Yeah, and if we compromise too much, that in the end it is possible that everyone will lose. So we might have to get to an agreement what we will focus on in the future. Paul added that the sweet spot idea is including the idea of making compromises. Yeah. And was about the importance that we should favor at the moment the grasslands that have the high biodiversity at the moment, because it is easier to keep high biodiversity than to restore it. I don't know. Then we had the issue of education and knowledge in society on permanent grasslands, on the value in terms of biodiversity, in comparison to forests, and what is nature actually, and yeah, the loss of knowledge and sensitivity of what is of high nature value. And Lynn was throwing in the issue of, if we talk about ecological restoration, how far do we want to go back, or do we want to go back? And it was mentioned that we probably have to find new solutions. We cannot go back for several reasons, and yeah, we have to find the new management that is feasible in reality or in the present that we have now. Okay, then
Can I just we didn't really debate that point. I want to stress that a lot of the grasslands that have disappeared very recently. So I don't know what the natural scientists say, but I don't think they're impossible to go back to. But I just wanted to get that in the notes.
No, I think this was more about the management measures. Like, we can't go back to old or historical management issues.
Okay, got it.
Right. Then to the third question, what changes need to be made? The issue of if the society should pay for the access to permanent grassland in order to support ecosystem delivery, which might or is probably not neither politically nor practically feasible, and this will also limit the access to the access and maybe also the value that is given to permanent grassland from society. Paul was stressing that we need more education on how to treat and how to behave in nature. Yeah, and then the issue of if we want to focus on the highest amount of permanent grassland overall, or if we want to focus on the highest possible biodiversity. Yeah, and we need to come to an agreement in these terms and set our measurements accordingly. And in this regard, we also depend on society, what is supported or what is allowed, so to say, from that side. Yeah, and then we were talking about compensation for farmers that is necessary if we want them to prioritize, for example, biodiversity. They should be compensated for the loss of productivity they're giving or they're taking. And this idea of compensation might also be feasible for permanent grassland that is managed more intensively, but then, for example, rewarding not polluting or going down in terms of pollution. For the last question, what future research needs to provide in terms of evidence for policy, and was stressing that carbon sequestration is an issue, and in terms of policy, definitely the topic of educating society in terms of importance of permanent grassland and what value is really delivered by these ecosystems. Yeah, this would be the main points I noted.
Thanks, Verena. Great job, and we'll get those written up with other people's notes. But yeah, I think this leaves me to thank everybody for their participation today. It's really useful discussion. Thanks, Eric, for taking on the task of trying to understand the CAP and the position of permanent grasslands within it. Yeah, just wish everybody a good day and hope everyone can join us at our final stakeholder conference in February next year. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.